I'm very, very happy to be here, especially because this is a theme I find quite interesting, given my work is generally focused in the UK, but we're obviously a very large organization with a global spread, and we often debate densities, and we have many perspectives around what constitutes good density, good growth. Is it vertical? Is it on the ground? Is it both? And so this theme is one I found quite interesting and was quite passionate in writing about 4 or 5 introductions to this theme until we actually agreed on one. Hopefully you will find it also quite interesting and find many perspectives amongst what our speakers are going to discuss today. Just to point to another aspect of our global reach as an organization, the BM Academy program has started in Madrid, founded by one of my colleagues, Jorge, who heads up the Madrid studio, and spread. We had some sessions in Singapore, and this is our first event here in London, and we aim to do other events following these. We have a wonderful panel, speakers panelists today, and we've got a wonderful moderator here. I'll just introduce briefly and then leave it up to her to develop on the theme and the panelists. So thank you very much, Emily Wright, who will be chairing this session for all of us. She was former editor at the States Gazette and is presently freelancing and working for The Space. And we're very, very pleased to have you chairing our BM Academy session in London. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just got a cheeky promotion there. Editor, well, Sam McClary and then Tim Burke. Well, I was one of the editors at Estates Gazette. And but thank you so much for that brilliant introduction. Thank you all so much for joining us, and quite the most compliant audience I've ever seen. You were sitting down 20 minutes before we were due to start. So thank you. I mean, the chairs are very inviting. So yes, as Anna said, I'm Emily Wright. I was formerly tech and global editor of Estates Gazette. I'm now a freelance journalist for The Times, Wallpaper, Dezeen, and The Spaces. And welcome to this Broadway Malyan think tank event on how good design can help city centres thrive sustainably into the future. And what a topic. Also, what a venue. It's absolutely amazing. So thank you so much to the venue for having us here. I didn't think that anything would be as exciting as the Celebrity Traitors this evening. I am so happy to be proven I am so happy to be proven wrong, both in terms of the venue and the panel, which I'm so confident about that I can already say it's going to be even better than whatever Claudia Winkleman has to offer this evening. And that is quite a stance. So the topic up for discussion tonight, it's perennially relevant, which you all know, that's why you're all here. But now so more than ever, so many lessons to be learned and so many great points to be made, and panelists here who are so primed and well positioned to talk about just that. So over the next hour or so, we're going to be delving into how complex density and integrated mixed use can promote growth, including learning some lessons from overseas. There will be plenty of time for questions at the end, and maybe even a bit of a group discussion. Everyone goes, oh no. But certainly time for questions. That's all part of it. So please do make notes of thoughts and any opinions that you might have and want to share when we finish the panel part of our evening. So our brilliant speakers, we are joined today by Ed Baker, Global Head of Urbanism and Group Chair at Broadway Malyan. Professor Yolanda Barnes, Principal of Yolanda Barnes Consulting, an Emeritus Professor of Real Estate at UCL. Peter Maxwell, Project Director, former Director of Design, London Legacy Development Corporation. And Paul Hewitt, Chief Operating Officer of Primera, representing the Eastern City bid. Thank you all so much for joining me and everybody here today, or this evening, I should say. So before we sort of delve into the depths of this panel, I'm just going to hand over to Ed, and I know that you've got some thoughts to share with us and some lessons and learnings.
Yes, indeed. Okay, welcome. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Broadway Malyan think tank. And what a fantastic venue. Actually, I've never been here before, and really amazing. So I'm going to set my stall out, and I'm going to wear the perspective of an urban designer. I'm also going to wear the perspective of somebody who's thinking globally. So obviously in my role of chair, I travel around, but also in terms of the work I do is very global. I'm going to provide the perspective of an urban designer, but also the perspective of thinking globally and bigger. And I'm going to start with this image. So this is Singapore, and actually this is where I lived and worked for over 10 years. We have a studio in Singapore, and this is the downtown of Singapore. And actually our office is probably not too far back from here. Unfortunately, this isn't our view, but this is a place at this time of year when it gets dark and colder. This seems to pop up in my algorithms on Instagram a lot, these images. But, so yeah, this is Singapore downtown. To also talk a bit about the bigger picture globally and think about global business districts, but also, most importantly, the competition between business districts. So obviously we're sat in London, and the ULI and Ernst Young did a study in 2020, and they'd previously done one 5 years earlier that talked about the most competitive business centres, and London is top, still top, and you've got places like New York, but that's changing, and I think what the timescale shows is that the places are changing. So what we're starting to see is the rise of more of the cities in the east. So they're the established places like Hong Kong, Singapore, but also new places like Dubai and Mumbai, and these new business centres that are happening. And a lot of the work that I do is around planning these new business centres. And the criteria when they do these studies, so obvious things: retaining talent, attracting talent, proximity to markets, the quality of the environment, which is my primary concern, global and local influence, and then innovative real estate. And I think we're going to talk about that today, the products, the assets within these business districts and how that's changing. So the questions that we posed today and what we'd like to talk about is, could the City of London learn from some of these examples in other parts of the world? Places that are very comfortable with density, very comfortable with planning around new transit nodes, and there's a real culture of mixed use, and that word mixed use is really important. I know it's not a new concept, but certainly working in Asia, working in the Middle East, this is something that is embedded in every project. So we talk about livability. This is this diagram really, you don't need to know about the detail, but essentially the pink is the change in the center of the Singapore downtown from this single office use into pink, which is this mixed use, residential, hospitality, culture, community uses, and that's the general planning shift that's been happening, particularly over the last 5 years in Singapore. And what you're starting to see in the centre and on the fringe and the edge of the city centre is this new mixed use development that's happening, lots of height, but it's about the ground level as much as the buildings in the sky and how they come together. And there's a number, you could put 5, 10, 15 of these new mixed use centres that are happening around, and that's that shift away from single-use buildings and assets into these really rich mixed-use districts. And this is one of our projects, which is on the edge of the CBD, looking at different uses, how they integrate within towers, but at the ground level, but also in the wider plan and how that comes together. So it's obviously working in Asia, you get used to verticality, density. We call this sort of, I suppose this is Hong Kong density. This is actually in Malaysia, but planning around transit centres. And so a lot of it's about integration with the transport, making the most of the transit opportunities, innovative economics like land value capture, so you can use the accessibility to drive opportunities for the real estate. And you get this type of planning, so the ground level experience and the integration, but thinking about the wider ecosystem of districts. Sustainability as well. I mean, obviously this is a very broad term. It can mean many different things. This is a project. This is a new business cluster we were looking at in Bangkok around the transit. Very much driven through community, trying to integrate, the landscape, the public realm, and then maximise obviously the opportunity of being near the public transport. And these mixed-use centres, these new business communities, and to go back to that initial slide when I talked about competition between centres, this is a new one in Bangkok. It's literally just being built about 3 or 4 months ago, and this is looking over one of the biggest parks in Bangkok, but these are new mixed-use business clusters with hotels, hospitality, office, obviously retail, and then a real emphasis on the public space. In this case, it's a very large sort of retention lake that helps manage the water in the city. And Japan is often used as a case study. So on a lot of the projects, I used to do a lot of visits to Japan, very innovative planning in terms of land value capture, using the heritage and how that could be promoting restoration, reuse, and then innovative funding mechanisms, how you can actually give more floor area to developers to go higher. And this is Tokyo Station. And then innovation, and I'll just this is the last international example. We do a lot of work in the Middle East, and really there's a lot of things happening in Asia, but also in the Middle East, and the innovation, perhaps it's around the governance and the speed at these projects are happening, but these are the places that are competing with the City of London. This is attracting talent. Young people want to go and work there from around the region, but really how these places are planning in different ways, being very innovative in how they mix uses in terms of accessibility and create these different type of business environments. And so then to come back, to London and thinking about the square mile and the City of London, and this is within the City of London, the opportunity for a different type of thinking, perhaps. And we know that there's a lot of things happening. There's the city plan, but perhaps in London there's other centres, other places like King's Cross, a lot more of a focus on restoration of the heritage, the mixed use, still density, but a slightly different scale. And perhaps are there some of the lessons that the City of London could use to sort of drive future planning, obviously some of the recent competition like Woods Wharf. And this is one thing that sort of came up 2 weeks ago, the Council for Tall Buildings and Urban Habitats, which is usually about buildings, they rebranded themselves as the Council for Vertical Urbanism. And this really sort of captures this whole movement, this sort of more holistic thinking on a larger scale, thinking at a density scale about places and the relationships, and it relates back to all the examples I've shared with you. And so really that's where I'll leave it. What do we need to think about as we think about places, whether we think about the City of London, the opportunities, what do we want for these new business centres, the change in use, the flexible use, is about governance. And this isn't saying that the East is brilliant and all these examples great and the City of London is bad, but perhaps it's about complacency, perhaps it's about speed of change, perhaps it's around more innovative planning mechanisms that will allow things to happen faster and in a different way, and perhaps drawing on some of these ideas from other places. And that is my introduction.
Thank you very much. Oops, it's not thank you. You can sit
down.
back down. And then I'd like to invite, I have never, ever had panellists leave before. I know why. I know why it was. I know there was a reason. And it was lovely to be able to see the screen. But that is the first time that's ever happened. So first time for everything. Thank you so much for that, Ed. Absolutely fascinating. But I'd like to go down the panel now, if it's okay, and just get a sense from each of you off the back of Ed's words there and your own experiences both in London and internationally as to why this topic is it's not just a hot topic now, it's always a hot topic, but why it's so important to you and what you are hoping to bring to the discussion from your particular stance. Yolanda, I'm coming to you first. I can see you're thinking, she's going to ask me first. Yolanda.
I was hoping that somebody else would kick off, but the reason we're thinking about how we design cities of the future is because quite probably cities of the past won't work. I come at this very much from a real estate point of view and have been thinking about value in real estate, what creates it, what drives it, for nearly 40 years now. And I think what we're just waking up to, as a lot of companies, architects, property advisors and others, have been sort of hoping for a return to normal. I think we're increasingly waking up to the fact that the late 20th century was a very abnormal period in history with a load of very different set of conditions, economic, financial conditions. And I think we've completely underestimated what the end of that era means in the built environment. So I would characterize the late 20th century as being made of, where we've seen the built environment, where we've seen cities kind of reduced to single asset classes, big buildings on big grids, made for automobiles rather than people, but also absolutely designed to fit, and forgive me, this is a whole semester's lecture, I'm trying to get into one sentence. These single-use buildings on big boxes on big grids are a phenomenon that suits late 20th century finance. And broadly speaking, the name of the game for big institutions was taking money from the baby boomers, deploying it for capital growth, and deploying it in big lumps. And that has been the way that form has followed finance in the cities of today. So what we're talking about here is more mixed use, more fine grain, more attention being paid to street level, and that fine grain, varied and messy mix that actually human beings have always rather liked. And the reason that we're paying attention to it is because the name of the game for those same big institutions who are deploying all that capital is now to pay the pensioners. Right across the world, it's about income. And so net income streams, I'm sorry to get so financial about this, and I think it's a bit of a, when I suggest that maybe modernism was just subverted by the bankers, I think it strikes a lot of architects as rather horrific. But what we're seeing now is a changing world where both the occupiers are suddenly incredibly important, because it's actually about how productive is the place. How does this place enable human beings to create and change and make and do all the wonderful things that human beings do, especially in new technology sectors. And it's no accident that a lot of innovative technology has not happened in the big CBDs with the big tall buildings, but it's in places like Shoreditch or Xintiandi in Shanghai, or indeed not so much in the Valley in California, in Silicon Valley, but actually increasing numbers of scale-ups and startups in San Francisco, actually wanting that fine-grained human city. So what we're seeing are world cities that are competing not so much for capital now, although that's always a thing, but actually for human capital, for talent. And so what human beings want in a city has become very much more important, both in terms of what it produces, those income streams to pay the pensioners, and in terms of how productive a city is and how it can thrive.
Thank you very much. Hello? Oh, there we go. Thank you very much, and we're going to come back to some of those points. Now, I wouldn't normally ask this, but could you either lift up your microphone or remove your scarf, which, there we go. That's probably the best. Thank you very much. Perfect. Peter, sort of same sort of question to you, really, sort of an overview about, how you're coming at this topic, and you've got a very, you've got a sort of the planner's view, the planner's eye view. What are your thoughts?
So first, kind of truth for me, I'm a professional itinerant. I studied architecture, then studied planning, and then finished off studying surveying. So I don't know where I am, but I'm probably at the center point of all those kind of professions, and that's probably where I'm coming from. The other thing I would say, for the last 10 years, as Emily kind of pointed out, I was working for the Development Corporation in Olympic Park. So I'm coming from a public sector developer viewpoint. And I think there's probably a few things I want to pick up on. And it is going to be local London as opposed to world cities. I'll let other panelists who are much better on that. But my perspective, probably with COP going on at the moment, is like coming back to the fundamentals. Like, I know the UN sustainability goals are not really talked about anymore, but the idea that kind of one of them is about kind of safe, inclusive, sustainable communities as part of cities. And I think mixed use is one of the ways to help deliver it. It's not the only way, but it is one of those bedrocks to actually deliver that. So I think that's one of the things I'm kind of interested in. And then built on that, it's not just about mixed use, and this is my public sector bit coming through. is actually about connectivity, and it's about proximity, and it's about exchange. That's the benefit of mixed use, that it actually allows the exchange of ideas, the exchange of people to meet and congregate either socially, academically, research or otherwise. And that's really important. And how do we do that in mixed use? And who takes, to Yolanda's point, who takes the heavy lifting? Is it the pension funds, or is it the public sector? Is it the developers? Is it the housing associations? How do we do that? And I think the key, no matter who takes that kind of burden, my professional career, I've spent a lot of time thinking about vision, but vision in terms of leadership, ownership, and stewardship. And I'm going to maybe come back to, in the discussion, about some of my personal examples about how you do that at a block scale as opposed to a master plan or a city centre, because I think mixed use at different scales has different connotations and different impacts, and they're not all the same. And the final thing, going back to the UN kind of stuff, is about actually, let's not talk about the financiers, although they're really important. Let's talk about the community in mixed use, and where are they in these discussions about how it's structured, what it's structured, and who it's structured for.
Brilliant, thank you. And we're going to do just that. So thank you very much. But before we go any further, Paul, your thoughts and your stance on this topic from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a couple of years away from sort of core property roles, but prior to that, I sort of spent 20, 25 years working for investors and developers, and a lot of that was in the city. I've got a fascination with tall buildings, and I think in London in particular, we've probably only scratched the surface in terms of what tall buildings can actually achieve. Spent a bit of time in Hong Kong, a bit of time in New York, and I think probably Asia is where to look, as Peter's already said, that there's a huge opportunity to do more, and the mixed use element is really interesting. I think the planning frameworks that we've got here are quite restrictive in some respects. I think there's some challenges that other countries don't have that we do. But there are huge opportunities, and certainly the work I'm doing at the moment is less to do with the property side, but more to do with the connectivity at street level. And the bids are doing an awful lot in that area. So it's an interesting topic on many levels, but I do think there is a lot we can learn from other cities around the world.
Thank you very much. So Ed, coming back to you on this then, we're going to go on to talk a little bit around whether it's fair to say there's been a bit of a resistance to sort of developing sort of at this level and at this scale in a city like London. What do you think it is about the culture and the attitude of other cities around the world, the ones that you were touching on previously, that has removed that barrier, or at least diminished that barrier and makes it that more ambitious, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge of making international comparisons is obviously the context is very different, and I think probably the number one context difference between, for example, Singapore and here is probably governance, and just the ability to make fast decisions and change. And the planning moves very quickly. I mean, I was there for about 13 years in total, and I used to say you can see cities grow in Asia. You can literally see it. You can see the planting grow because it's tropical, but you can also see the cities grow. And I think I saw when I was in the city, you'd get used to seeing projects announced, and then they'd be built, and it used to constantly surprise me,
Built?
Yeah, exactly.
What?
There'd be an announcement. You'd see the
Surely
CGI,
not.
and then 3 years later, there it would be. And these were big community projects, or they'd announce a new metro line, and then it'd be there. And I think probably that thing is the number one thing that probably drives. It's about governance, and that might relate to the planning, which is different in different places. But yeah, I think that's probably the one thing I would highlight.
Thank you. And Peter, we're going to talk a bit more about the planning. But before we do, Yolanda, you've covered off a bit of this in that excellent introduction. But in terms of this reticence here in London and potentially other UK cities as well to develop a large quantum of mixed use, is this changing? Are we seeing that changing? Is there a shift in investor demand? Is there a shift in occupier demand, community demand? The floor is yours.
Yeah, mixed use has been something I've been banging on about for, since Chelsea harbour over the road was being built, because that was a very good example of how not to do mixed use. There was commercial block there and residential block there, and it really nearly came a cropper because it was intended that the commercial would be retail. And the idea was that everybody would park their car underground, come up through the retail and spend money before going home. It turned into a complete liability. And an awful lot was learnt by Chelsea Harbour in the 1990s when they had to repurpose the whole commercial block. And they did so very successfully. And they did it through curation. An individual actually went and really thought about what would work there, and that's why we've got design, interior design all over this area. That was a conscious piece of curation. Found the same thing happening recently at Canary. Well, actually, back when Canary Wharf was built. I don't think many people know this, but very, very little retail was planned there. Instead, vast amounts of underground car parking were planned. And thank goodness they were, because, of course, the car parking wasn't needed, because Londoners tend not to drive to work. And instead, a large amount of retail was needed, because people want to, whether they're in working environments or living environments, people want to live. And living involves very much more than just consuming or just dwelling. And so, again, that was an act of active curation as the very good management of Canary Wharf built a whole underground shopping mall out of the parking. The same thing's happening now. Conditions have changed. People don't want to go up to the whatever floor to do the things that they used to do 20 years ago. And so, again, active curation is not just a kind of nice to have, it's absolutely essential to the viability and future of these schemes. But what I do want to do is just put into the mix the idea that if we want to intensify and mix the use of cities, because after all, we don't live in a housing unit, or we don't work in an office. We live and work in neighbourhoods. And I think your point about blocks, but I'd say we've actually got to pay attention to neighbourhood level productivity, building, curation, management, and so forth. I just want to get away. Vertical doesn't necessarily work in that context, and it doesn't necessarily provide the highest density. My work on the highest density neighbourhoods in North America and Europe, even in New York City, are mid-rise. If you want intensity of use, actually mid-rise blocks and that flexibility, so they can be repurposed, can be much better. And I think that a lot of Far Eastern cities are going to hit big problems as we discover that, to Ms. Corbusier, high-rise towers are expensive machines for living in. And I think, coming back to the sustainability goals, sustainability isn't a nice-to-have add-on. It's absolutely central to value. A lot more people in the real estate world are becoming concerned about asset destruction, whether it be from rising sea levels or extreme weather conditions or fires or whatever. I think the capability of a building to be resilient or even anti-fragile maybe put some of the expensive to run, expensive to live in, tall towers. I mean, we've just seen the complete collapse of Neom. I don't know if anybody saw the FT today, but there's a bit of an obituary written for it. It says it's killed by finance and physics. What interests me is that nobody ever considered how people would actually live in this incredible, imaginative sort of piece of art architecture, but I think we've got to go back to the basics of actually how we create value, and that's through people thriving in places.
Thank you very much. It's an excellent point, one that we're gonna come on to and discuss a bit later on. So thank you very much for flagging. And Peter, I'm going to come back to you on connectivity and planning, but before I do, just off the back of what Yolanda was saying there about high-rise versus mid-rise, Paul, I'd like to come to you on that, because you were saying earlier that you are a huge fan of all things high-rise, and obviously the work that you're doing with the Eastern City bid is a cluster of tall towers. What are your thoughts on Yolanda's point there?
It's a valid point. I think that the challenge being is there's not a huge amount of land available, so you've got to go up. I've dealt with some big buildings that are low rise, and they were built for a specific occupier on a 30-year lease, and it worked perfectly from an investment point of view. Tall buildings have got they bring the opportunity to offer more in terms of the amenities that occupiers are now looking for. And I did a bit of work on some leasing campaigns for some buildings over the years, and if you've got the height, it does make it a lot easier to bring in some amenities that you wouldn't be able to do on a sort of a lower rise building. But I sort of on the neighbourhood point, it's really key, and I think there is a sort of a downside to going tall. But it's interesting, because obviously I've come at this from a sort of a developer's point of view historically, and trying to, we wouldn't be building anything unless it made commercial sense, it was viable, and you had strong interest from the occupiers. So developers will generally adapt to what businesses need, and I think that's constantly evolving. I'm not sure if I really answered your question there, but I think maybe parts of it.
Thank you very much. Peter, there's been some talk around, I want to come back to the point about King's Cross, actually, because it's really interesting, because you made a good point there, Ed, that it's quite difficult sometimes to compare London to, say, a Singapore, because it's such different governance. But looking at the city versus King's Cross, or not versus, but the city and King's Cross, that's interesting, and I want to come back to that. But it'd be really interesting, Peter, to talk to you a bit more about the planning aspect and the connectivity. When you're talking about King's Cross, the connectivity there is absolutely amazing. How important is all of that, and how important, as a sort of an overarching umbrella point, is the involvement of public sector when we're talking about these sorts of developments?
So I'm private sector at the moment. I was public sector for a long time, private sector before that. So from a public sector point of view, absolutely fundamental. And I think that's what I was coming back to in terms of the heavy lifting that needs to be done. Generally 9 times out of 10 in this country, it's the public sector that will do the heavy lifting and underwrite the significant infrastructure works that need to happen. So obviously King's Cross has had a number of different bits of infrastructure put in terms of HS1, in terms of some of the lands, and also in terms of the upgrade for Network Rail around the station. Generally, you can trace most, like I said, I worked in Stratford, HS1 again, it had Jubilee Line trains kind of put in, it's had a whole series of other improvements, and that's where some of the connectivity and proximity comes from, because it's bringing people to a particular place. Generally, the public sector in this country, as of yet, will not. They are the ones that need to step up, and that's why for 5 years I did a business case on Stratford Station in particular to expand it, because it takes a long time and you have to tick a lot of boxes from lots of different. In other parts of the world, that isn't the case. I used to live in New Zealand and work a bit in Australia and work a bit in the Far East, and then there is different models, such as the kind of mass transit guys in Hong Kong, where they actually develop the whole asset class together. They take the risk on the station, they also then take the risk and the reward in terms of the commercial and residential above that. Is the UK ready to kind of divest itself or have a different kind of approach in terms of what it wants to do with that public infrastructure? Not as of yet. But as I just said to you, in terms of Stratford Station, that has a cost of, I think, when we worked out, about £1 billion. Business cases generally has to be above 2. It was into 3 or 4. There is no money available. So we're going to have to adapt. To Yolanda's point about kind of asset classes, I think the infrastructure that we fund in this country needs to come from a different model as well. And that's where, for my money, there is an opportunity to look
It
at.
sounded like you were saying that would be my money. Come for me and send it for my money.
Yeah,
Because
my
you-
money. I'm going to be
That's
investing.
very generous of you.
Yeah, so from my kind of perspective, it needs to be kind of a balance. It's not saying that it all should be a model from imported from somewhere else, but to balance some of the kind of public finance issues we have just now, that's one way to do it.
I mean, do any of the other panelists have anything to add on that? Because that's a really interesting point. I mean, that's a big one as well, isn't it? You know, the whole systemic change, effectively, or a systemic alteration.
I do actually, because I think your comments about infrastructure investment in the Far East, sort of combined with real estate, I think it's really interesting, really pertinent, because we just heard about a 30-year lease from Paul, and I think that for technical reasons, I'm wondering how to frame this. We are in a much longer term financial environment now than we used to be in the late 20th century, for a whole host of reasons. But a 30-year lease, 30-year lifetime of a building just won't cut it in the 21st century when the returns are going to be inadequate. So what we're talking about is creating long-term, robust and sustainable income streams. That sort of profile of investment is much more akin to a long-term big infrastructure project, which tended, and even in the past, to be funded over a 50-year period. We weren't looking at 25 years or 30 years, sort of lifetime. And I think people talk about long-term patient capital. I'm not sure it's quite that, but it's just expecting a different type of return over a different time scale that's going to actually shift, and already potentially is shifting, what we build and how we build. And in those circumstances, long-life, loose-fit buildings that can be adapted to who knows what technology is going to do to changing the work environment. If one virus, can revolutionize our working practices, what is AI going to do over the next few decades? We've got to get comfortable with not knowing how our buildings are going to be used in 30 years' time, and definitely not having the option of demolishing them and sort of throwing them away and starting again. So the people who curate these places and adapt the buildings and repurpose them, probably on a regular basis, are not going to be looking for the same thing as they were in the last century.
Thank you so much for that. And Paul, I'm going to come to you in a minute about what's going on in the city and the Eastern City bid in a bit more detail. But before I do that, Ed and the rest of the panel, I'm so interested in that point around, could the City of London be more like King's Cross? Because in my mind, I think that sounds fantastic. And then I look at the two places and think, well, how would that work? So I'd love it if there was a bit more detail on what your thoughts are on that. And then perhaps it makes sense then to finish up with Paul, you kind of giving your point on that too, from the other side. So Ed, what would that look like and how would that work?
I mean, I think that the success of King's Cross has been phenomenal, and actually with clients in lots of different places, we're constantly asked for people to visit and go and see King's Cross and learn from King's Cross. And it's the whole King's Cross story. I think we all know that one of the successes of King's Cross was the emphasis placed on the community in the early stages, and the early catalyst involved the reuse of existing buildings and really creative, early catalyst tenants, when it was, the art college coming in, and then some of the people, and obviously the innovation angle as well, and being really creative in terms of some of the tenants and businesses. So I think, it's just, I suppose it's the richness of King's Cross, it's the lucky and the diversity of some of the buildings, but the City of London has these buildings as well, and maybe it's the City of London just maybe letting its hair down a little bit. And you've got the towers and the density, but just really sort of thinking a bit more about the mix and the uses in there as well. And some of these buildings are going to need to be re-looked at soon as well in terms of the mix. And maybe it's being more creative with the community uses or just other things that could happen in there. And I think that's what King's Cross has sort of created an example of that, and that neighbourhood we talked about earlier as well.
Paul, can the City of London let its hair down at all?
I think it can.
Yeah.
Whether it will is another question. It's funny. I think the city's it's wrapped in tradition that is quite important, and it's still very celebrated. There's a huge amount of heritage there, and I think they've done very well at finding the right balance between introducing sort of the new iconic sort of pioneering developments versus and protecting the heritage sites. I think they've done a very good job at that, and I think that they do have an ability to adapt, respond to whatever comes in the direction of the city. I don't think it will happen in the near future. Simple reason, because there's so much demand for sort of your almost traditional office buildings, and while that demand is there, and investors can see good returns and everything else, I think that will continue to flow that way. But I think if it comes a time where there is a sort of a demand for different uses, I think then it will move in that direction. I do think that.
Do you think we might see sort of smaller scale interventions sort of paving the way for that, sort of in a bit more of a shorter time frame, rather than going, sort of all out with it, setting things in motion?
Yeah, I think that's probably really what the bids are there to do. So if anyone's not familiar with the bid model, it's they're business improvement districts, which is, I suppose essentially it's businesses volunteering to pay an additional tax, but that tax goes into a pot that they control. So we, across the city, there's 5 business improvement districts now in the City of London. And we are, I suppose, a single voice for over 1,000 businesses that occupy space within the city. And they're hugely invested in it, and they want to control change, really. So the money that they put into the bids goes towards interventions that they want to see happen, their staff want to see happen. A lot of that is sort of activations at street level, so really small-scale events, things like that. But then we've very recently appointed a big consultant collectively across the 5 bids and with the City Corporation to develop a city-wide ground floor use strategy, which has not really been done historically. They've always looked at sort of pockets or sort of, subsections of the city, or it would be specifically looking at development, whereas actually looking at that across all developments, all locations in the city, try to get the right flow, the right mix of retail, the right offer. I think that's probably a really good example of a small-scale intervention that can make a real difference.
Thank you very much. And we've talked a lot about, the investment cases and logistics, connectivity, but it's been really heartening and not at all surprising to hear all of you at various points within those conversations talk about community, people, human beings, and that's what it's all about. And I think it'd be really useful to delve into that in a bit more detail, because community engagement can be done well, it can be done badly, it can be done in no way at all. I think, I know the answer to this question, but obvious, how important is that? And actually, if anyone has any examples of where they think it's been done particularly well, or it's sort of fallen short, that would be useful too. I can see you all thinking now. But Ed, let's start with you on that.
Yeah, I sort of deliberately chose a variety of projects at the beginning, not just in terms of location, but in terms of types of projects. And obviously in planning, we obviously talk about top-down versus bottom-up planning. I showed an example, the first one in Bangkok, which actually, that project was done, UN Habitat were one of the partners on that project. And then we did a lot of, that was very much, stakeholder engagement, community consultation on if you do density and you do height, how would, engage in the community and what they would like to see, particularly around the ground level as well, and the other types of uses that would go in there. So we did some really interesting extended consultation actually on that project. Some of the ones I've showed, let's be honest, perhaps one in Dubai, which might have had a different type of stakeholder consultation, but probably wasn't community-based, so, or a certain type of community anyway. So, but it really depends on the context. But I wanted to show, there's some other ones on there I could talk about as well from that angle. But
that was very diplomatically put. Well done. Yolanda, how important is it? Examples of where it's been done well, where it hasn't been done so well?
So I'm just conscious of this thing drooping all the time. So I was thinking about Singapore, and I think we when we think about community and creating community, we instantly think about residential and very often social housing projects. But the reason why you're getting a lot of street level activation in Singapore, in these sort of big schemes, even where there are tall towers above them, is, I think, and this is conversations I've had with developers in Singapore, what they observed was that at the time of the digital sort of revolution, when tech started to be a big thing in the city, the place that all these globally footloose sort of potential billionaires wanted to be was in the shop houses.
Yeah.
And suddenly there was a huge surge in demand for the shop houses, the traditional sort of Chinese streets and small buildings, which were being adapted and sort of wired up and so forth. That's typical of so many other cities. I mean, it was Shoreditch, not the city, that Silicon Roundabout that was the heart of what happened in London, and I think a lot of these sort of big building owners and the real estate world had to sit up and take notice, because the occupiers, the tenants, were not so concerned about the building and the name at the top of the building, but rather asking, and weren't even asking about sort of some of the technical aspects of floor to ceiling height and square footage that they had been in the past. They were asking, where's the best neighbourhood for me to be able to attract these highly valuable sort of entrepreneurial sort of tech wizards and so on. And suddenly neighbourhood became the commodity, not the building space. And that was true in Singapore. And so that, bizarrely, I think, has actually affected the street scale level. You've seen it in Hong Kong to some extent, the realization that these big towers just kill the street. And active thinking about how to activate the street has become very important. And I think, and again, we've talked about King's Cross. The thing about King's Cross is that Roger Madeleine always said he wanted it to be a part, this shows how far back the planning of it goes, a part of the A to Z. In other words, part of London's streetscape. So paying attention not only to neighbourhoods, but to streets. And although King's Cross is mixed use, but fundamentally a lot of commercial, that didn't stop the community engagement element.
Yeah.
And I often say to people who think that community engagement doesn't have value, or co-creation is a big, expensive faff that is going to cost you money, over and over again, I see it actually making for better solutions and creating better solutions and actually saving developers money. And just a little example is Roger Madeleine says that at one consultation, a local resident arrived at King's Cross with a map of all the unexploded World War II bombs on the site. I hate to think how many hundreds of thousands that saved them in ground condition surveys and what have you. So there is value to this.
Thank you very much, and a brilliant selection of anecdotes there as well, which is always fantastic in an answer. Thank you very much. Peter, same question to you. You've mentioned community throughout your answers so far. Sort of same perspective, really. Not same perspective, same question, different perspective, maybe.
Probably 3 examples, and maybe broaden it out again. Because my background's not high-rise, city centre London or city centre kind of Singapore. I think community engagement for me, like proper community engagement, begins with actually understanding what the hell's going on. And so I'd kind of give an example of Harlow, existing new town. It's going through a lot of change. They're planning, I think, 16,000, 23,000 new homes around its periphery. But they've actually invested, the collective of the authorities invested in understanding through, there's a proprietary quality of life to speak to the residents about how it is to live in Harlow at this moment, and year on year how it is to live and what is important to them. Because I think unless you have that intelligence of what is actually going on, you're kind of flying blind in terms of trying to take any leadership or anything like that. So I think that's one thing. At the Olympic Park, I'm sure, like King's Cross, it'll be kind of Marmite, they'll be good. People think it's a good example, bad example. But one of the things that I think we spent a lot of time and effort in terms of the vision and leadership was an example in the west of the park and around Hackney Wick. That basically around Hackney Wick, it was proposed in the local plan to be a new kind of neighbourhood centre. That neighbourhood centre is straddled between, on either side of a river. One part's existing, another part is yet to be developed. And we actually, it comes a little bit back to Yolanda's point about what is value, is that we wanted to seed new uses into that town centre well in advance of any housing coming forward. If you looked at the development appraisal, it was completely underwater. You talk to my finance director, they say, absolutely, we are not going to do this. But that was one of the best things we did. We built a kind of series of mean well uses, but on a long, like 10 years of mean well use that could seed businesses into the area, that when the actual units were available, there was a lease mechanism that they could move into the permanent place. And that was with the community building what they need. So I think that's a good example. And then an example that I don't know enough about it, but I kind of put it out there. And I mentioned, I think, to Anna before, is I'm really curious about New York and the amount of investment that went on in Hudson Yards. And so it did a lot of the things. It did a lot of the things that Ed was talking about in terms of getting global investment, getting kind of high net worth individuals, bringing kind of cultural people there. It's got a whole series of new kind of cultural things. But the one thing it's definitely massive backlash is it's seen as a playground for the rich. There is no local community represented in any shape or form. It feels like it's completely privatized. So there are kind of things to be balanced here and decisions to be made about how it's not just how the things look and what the uses are brought in, but actually how it's managed and operated into the long term. And that needs to be thought right at the beginning. It's very hard to claw that back because it feels forced. The community feels forced. They feel like they haven't been included from the beginning. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. And finally, Paul, your thoughts on the power of community, the community in the city maybe, or whichever stance you want to take.
I mean, a different name, I guess, for a business improvement district is a community improvement district, and that would be when it's sort of a mix of business and sort of resident-led. But the model's essentially the same. That's what exists. They're bringing the businesses together, and then they do things that the businesses collectively want them to do in a sort of hyper-local area. I mean, in the city, it's no great secret. I think across the 5 bids, we're probably collecting about £10 million a year in bid levy. That money goes directly back into that local area. EC bid is the biggest. It's got the hugest, the largest floor area. So business rates are significant, and that's kind of what our income is based on. So it spends a huge amount of money on activations. We do a lot around the cheese grater, so all around the Lloyd's building, and it's hugely popular actually for occupiers and their staff in the area. So look, I think there's a huge need for it. I think that bringing people out of their workplace and into sort of a community environment, markets, different food options, huge demand, and I think it will continue to grow. I mean, one sort of tall building sort of example I did want to give, and it didn't quite work out how it was intended, but I know a big selling point for the walkie-talkie that I worked on for a long time to the occupiers in the building was they would have this sort of exclusive access to the Sky Garden before members of the public would be allowed to go. And that was a huge selling point, and it was part of the reason it was so successful from a leasing point of view. And the idea being different insurance occupiers would be able to go up there in the mornings and in the evenings and have this sort of private meeting place where they could sort of connect with each other. And it was brilliant when it first opened. But I think the problem was that the public demand was so strong, it ended up taking over the office occupiers to the point they didn't want to go there anymore. But I think as a principle it was quite good, and I think it probably will come back at some point in a way that it does create that sort of vertical connectivity.
Thank you so much. I'm very conscious of time. I do have to check in with the people sitting on. Everyone's still okay? Yep, no backs to these chairs. Okay, fine. So I'm going to open it up to the floor for a few questions. I'm just going to let the panel know that after the questions, there'll be one more from me, which is your favourite place in London, and also the place in the world that you feel London has the most lessons to learn from. So give you a bit of time to think about that. So does anyone in our audience have... Yep. Oh, right, okay, so we start over there. We've got one there, one here, one here, one here. Oh, my goodness, right. So do we have a microphone, or are we going to shout? Thank you, that'd be great.
Sally Lewis, Broadway, Malyan. I'm really interested to hear all the talk about King's Cross. It's everyone's favourite place. But I think that the reason why it's so successful is not just the fact that it's mixed use and does all those things really well. It has amazing generosity of space. It's the quality of the space, and it's the sort of democracy of the space. So it's not just the local community who consulted on it. Everyone wants to go there, and they all feel like they belong there. And I just wonder from the panel if people are looking at this and learning lessons. And in Asia, all the photos are always from the sky. Does anyone ever take photographs from the ground? And are any spaces in Asia anything like generous and as wonderful quality?
Shall I start
Yeah,
with
Ed,
that one?
yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the images perhaps I've selected, but there are a few ground level views in there. So I think one thing I'm sure everyone's been to Asia, one thing they do very well is ground level activation and the richness of the cities. So cities like Bangkok and Singapore as well is just that, that activation throughout the weekday, weekends, long into the evenings as well. So I think the popularity of King's Cross from our clients' perspective is just how it's come together. It is the open spaces probably is the main thing they like, and I think that probably Singapore has some amazing open spaces, but yeah, like you said, the King's Cross ones are particularly generous and democratic, and right there in the centre of the city. But
Thank you. I'd love to open it up to the rest of the panel, but I'm conscious of time, and the panel will be here afterwards, so maybe you could ask them for their opinions too. There was, could we pass the either pass the microphone down, or if you feel comfortable shouting, probably not. Microphone might be best.
Hi. So my question is regarding something outside of the mixed spaces and what you guys have been developing. So it's the first port that anybody comes into within England, and that's our airports. I'm sure most people here are quite well travelled. The airports in East Asia, airports in the Middle East are stunning. What can be done about our airports, and how can you guys get involved in
They are absolutely beautiful. I don't know what you're talking about. Gorgeous airports. Who would like to take that? I mean, there's... Ed, I mean,
I can start. I mean, airports, yeah, it's slightly different, slightly shift, but yeah, we can talk about, I'll talk about Singapore. I mean, when I first moved there, and people gave me a list of the best things about Singapore, number one was the airport. And I thought, well, that's a bit miserable, isn't it? That's the place it's the arrival bit. I mean, if everyone's been to Changi, it is an amazing airport. And actually, I think it's a community within an airport, and that's what makes it successful. It's got everything in there.
The King's Cross of airports.
The King's Cross of airports, exactly.
They can have that.
A little bit more air conditioning, but yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else has got any points on airports. I mean, I can only comment from a traveller perspective, but thank you very much.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We're going to pass. There's a question here. Would you mind passing the microphone down?
That was absolutely brilliant. My question is something I think you were all about to touch on, but you never said it, which is human experience. So in a way, you're talking about density, and you can measure that, and you can add it up, and you can put that in terms of the blocks of a building and how it works, and you can put numbers to it. But then you're talking about, I think, human experience, whether it's at ground level, in the verticality, whether it comes to the street. And I'm really interested in what you think about how we measure human experience in the future so that that can be understood better, because you definitely touched on the fact that it's not understood. And what are your thoughts about how that might be approached in the future, whether that's looking at what you're doing in BID or what you've learned through universities and those subjects? So that's my question.
Brilliant. Who'd like to take that?
I've answered the last two, so... Yeah.
I have looked a lot. I think what I was trying to say is that human experience is everything. This is what's driving value. So the human experience, whether it's in Shoreditch or the shop houses of Singapore, was what drove value and has driven change already in terms of the sort of environments that we want and accept. I mean, I'm really interested in the business improvement districts because, and you talk about the generosity of space. You know, there's this feeling that we're being generous if we get things right, if we actually cater for what people, workers and occupants actually want and need. Actually, that is what provides the value of the space. I'd love to see business improvement districts change into district improvement businesses, because you've got to find a way of actually participating in all that wonderful value that you create. But I think there is a business in it. I think what we mean by value, we've thought about it very commercially, and I'm so glad you mentioned Harlow. I did a piece of work on Harlow because we're trying to see when they're mooting the Harlow North extension, what Harlow needed to improve. And the answer was just about everything. It was really noticeable how Harlow had a deficit of all human activity. If you wanted jobbing builder, you had to go to a neighbouring place because there were no spaces to put, the work tools and machinery and what have you. The reason I say this is because I think it highlights something really important about 20th century planning, and design, the way we've done cities. And that is that the problem with Harlow was that it was all provided as either offices in one place, retail in another place, residence or industrial, all separated out. There were none of those in-between messy spaces for human activity, like, I know, a catering kitchen or a funeral parlour, or, all those things that human beings need. So the human element had been completely ignored. And as a result, it was deficient in all sorts of economic and human activity. This devalues the place. And if we keep sticking to planning use classes, whether we call them zones or planning use classes, what they actually are, they've been completely subverted by the investment industry. They're just 20th century investment asset classes. And instead, we've got to think about how people actually use cities and always have used cities. You start listing all the things that people do in cities: dancing, feasting, mating, meeting, making. These are things that we just don't consider, and there's a richness that's just completely missing in our planning and design system. And if we keep building blocks of single-use buildings, then we're going to miss out on that human value.
Thank you very much for using the word mating, because Roger Madlin said the same thing on a panel and he didn't use that word. So I really appreciate that. So, I mean, Paul, I've got to ask, from BID to DIB, it would be district improvement businesses. What are your thoughts on that?
You can call them what they want, whatever you want, to be honest. And it's where we've had a few sort of conversations internationally about the model and the type of vehicle. You can really call it whatever you want. I mean, ultimately, it's a community-focused vehicle that invests in very specific things. But I mean, getting on to the the measurement of satisfaction or experience, it's interesting. I did a lot of this as a working with property owners and managing portfolios, and you would do annual surveys or 6-monthly surveys around customer satisfaction. You do exit surveys and shopping centres, you do them at visitor attractions, and you'd constantly be trying to get a read on what people want and what they weren't happy with, so you could then adapt your style, entry experience, whatever it might be. I mean, BID's their entire business is built on engagement with stakeholders. So the business plan is written off the back of perception analysis, which is basically structured stakeholder engagement. It's done throughout a 5-year term. And it's constant, and we've got people on the streets talking to people to try and understand, what they like about a particular event that we put on, what they don't like, what else they'd like to see. So we're trying to use that intelligence to sort of inform what we do and how we do it. And I think there's probably more that can be done. It'd be interesting to see whether AI has got a place in any of this, and you can sort of start monitoring people's reactions to a particular activity or something like that, but that's not my sort of area of expertise. But it's there is a lot more measurement needed, and I think if we can capture that, it will inform a lot of decisions, be that management, development, or anything else.
Thank you. Peter?
I think to your point, the naive part of me is definitely the technological revolution surely should help, but one of the things that needs to happen is the silos need to be kind of broken down. It's like, I'm always amazed. Maybe it's, excuse the language, it might be bullshit, but I hear all the PBSA guys and the build-to-rent guys, and they tell me they've got all this data about exactly the customer segmentation, what people want from build-to-rent property, and how it's changing, and how that then changes the asset class and everything else. They know everything inside out. It's like, well, I know there's a commerciality, but how can we share that? How can the built environment professions actually do the job? I know you don't get paid to do kind of post-occupancy evaluation, but how many of you go back and actually speak to the people you've designed for and find out whether or not it worked the way you did it? Can we combine that with the kind of developers and the kind of building owners and the managers of public space, so we get a kind of collective view from different perspectives to get that kind of intelligence? Because at the moment it's all behind paywalls, or it's kind of within the fiefdom of a particular organisation.
So is it a call for a human experience index of cities that every development has to play into? Provide that data.
Yeah, I think
it's shared. Is that your?
Yeah,
is that
kind of. And at least again with the public sector, if we're spending lots of taxpayer money, then that's part of the deal. If you're spending lots of money on airports or hospitals or whatever else, actually, what actually happens and how people experience it should be recorded. I told you it was naive.
I think Related Argent have got their flourishing index, which I don't know how much people know about, but that's quite an interesting sort of look at measuring human experience, I think. But are there any more questions? I'm looking over here because I don't want anyone to feel left out.
Someone over here.
Anyone? Oh, we've got where?
The back there. Yeah.
Okay, so we go to the back and then to the front, and then we probably need to wrap up because otherwise people are going to end up sort of literally falling off these. Yes, exactly. And the traitors, yeah.
Yeah,
Hi, I'm Charlie Payne from Magenta Associates. So I just had a quite interesting sort of observation, I guess like the relationship between like the planner and the manager, I guess, the place planner who sort of builds the initial sort of structures, and then the managers who sort of are there long after the structures are built. And I think one thing that stood out for me, I guess, like, was, what do you think the most important thing about getting that relationship right between those sort of two different arms of place, I guess? What do you think the most important thing about getting the synergy right between you guys is?
Who would like to take that one? Am I going to?
Happy to. I think probably dodged the question, but it's part of the same continuum. You've got to start out from figuring out what the ownership model is going to be, even if it's loosely in terms of the stewardship model. Because if you don't do that, you're going to have a whole series of problems when the asset is handed over and you go, what the hell am I going to do with this now? So that's one thing. So the planner needs to think about that, needs to think about the commerciality of what is going on as much as the vision and spatial leadership. The other thing I would say is that the planner needs to think, and I think we've all talked about flexibility, is actually when you're creating something, think about how this asset is going to be used well into the future, and allow some flexibility. So if you look at, like we've talked about Roger Madeline and Argent and British Lands, particularly like with Canada Wharf at the moment, Canada Water, the idea that the plots that are being developed there have flexibility in terms of the codes and development specs. So as the market shifts, it can shift as well. It's not preserving the aspect that this is going to be an office block, that's going to be kind of, and so that needs to be thought about as well, because we're all talking about places that accrete over time. They take a lot of time to develop. If it's one building or a town centre, it could take 30 years. And your view on now is not going to be sufficient if you're trying to predict all the outcomes. You need to allow for that flexibility in terms of planning structures.
I think it goes beyond flexibility. I think we have to get more and more comfortable with what I call hypermixity, which is actually curation on steroids that managers, and I've seen this done in something that used to be called Student Hotel, is now called The Hub. It's a mixture of hotel, shared workspace and student accommodation in various cities. And the name of the game there is maximising, if you like, the productivity of every square foot, square metre, if you want to talk about that. And that means absolutely understanding your customer. And I think understanding not just the customers who've been in the past that you've measured and done your surveys on, but actually understanding the next customer, the customer of the future. And that requires being plugged into the city, not just your building, in a way that, you know, traditional landlords just haven't been before. So, hypermixity, that means letting things out on an hourly, letting space on an hourly basis if that's required. Forgetting the long, the full repairing and ensuring 25-year modernity rent review leases.
Thank you very much. I'm so conscious of time. I think we've got time for one. Oh, we've got a question there. Oh, we'll see what we can do. But we're going to have to. I might have to. You might be let off the hook with your London preferences. Okay.
Hi. So, Saidu from Malyan, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on the concept of the elephant in the room, the disruptor. Your understanding on the current affairs with AI, with our cities at the moment. I wish to know your thoughts, especially in the academia, as we have the Prof in the house.
So AI, I mean, I'm really pleased that I'm not being asked this question.
Very quickly, I think that we've talked a little bit about silos, the problem of these sort of specialist silos, and I hope that the flavour of this conversation has been very much about how we have to pay attention to everything everywhere all at once, really, to get our cities right. We can't go on just predicting and providing this top-down sort of highly artificial sort of series of land uses. I think that's where AI comes in, because I think AI can help us handle the complexity in a way that we've never been able to before. And it can gather information. So we've talked about how do you measure, human experience. Well, actually, there's a load of data. We give it away all the time on one of our sort of handheld devices, about where we're going and what we're doing and how we're enjoying it. AI can actually start making sense of that. So AI can actually, if you like, measure that place productivity, that magic fairy dust of place, and help us make the decisions that are going to lead to more sort of humanly optimal outcomes, in my view.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry to everybody that the questions and answers are getting shorter and shorter. There's a question here at the front. Could we pass the microphone forward? This might have to be our last one. I'm sorry, Anna, did you want... Okay.
Hi, my name is Mamuna. I'm from a company called Moving Minds. It's my company about podcast and mental well-being. But on a side note, I want to ask a question to all four of you, and you as well, Emily.
You have literally 7 seconds each to answer the question.
So my question is, can buildings be sentient? And that means, how can we take buildings being airports as meeting points, transit points, having vertical mode of transportation and horizontal mode of transportation, but also looking at buildings can be micro cities within a building. So having towns within sort of the horizontal landscape, penetration on street level, but also having access for public so that it does not become a singular bubble of community. So cross-pollination, if you will. So looking different ways of thinking how communities, cultures can interact with each other. And AI being one point is that...
Whoa. No, I'm sorry.
So I would
we
like
feel-
to understand if buildings can be sentient.
That is one of the best questions I've ever heard. I mean, that's a really efficient use of the question there. I mean, we do have very limited time, so it's a great point there around, that sentient aspect. I'm not going to have time now to ask my London questions. You're off the hook. So let's use that as our last question. We'll come up through the panel if sort of people could try and take something from what was, a really interesting collection of questions, and the idea about the future of cities, in any way that you want to. So, Paul, I'm looking at you. I'm going to start with you.
Okay. I think Bloomberg's building in the city is probably a really good example of how you started, anyway. Where you sort of enter and you have to go up the slope and everyone has to sort of meet in this sort of central area. I can't remember the name of it, but it sort of forces that human interaction, regardless of where you're positioned in the building. I thought that was quite an innovative design, something that you could apply probably on any scale, actually. I don't know what other parts of the question I want to answer, to be honest.
I think that's fine. Peter?
I don't even know where to start. Can buildings be sentient? I'm not sure. Maybe?
I love it. That's a brilliant answer. Maybe. Honestly,
no,
that's great.
I suppose I'm immediately thinking about Hong Kong and Wan Chai and that district, and so it's not our future. It's an existing place, but that to me is the microcosm. Just so I can pinpoint, if we had Google Maps in front of us, pinpoint one street there, and it has the entire city in the space of one street. You have all the interaction horizontally and vertically. So it kind of, in my mind, exists. But I was born in the 20th century, so maybe I can't think that far.
So was I.
From maybe to a fabulous answer. Thank you very much. Yolanda?
Yes, I think they can.
Brilliant.
I think some buildings are already robots with roofs on, and if we allow digital twins to evolve, I think they could very well be. But it's interesting. You also mentioned what I would call there's a sentient building, but then there's also the animated building, and I think that's going to come down to the same thing as it always has. Human beings' capability of interacting, whether on the ramps in the Bloomberg building or wherever. So it's combining the sentient building with the animated building, the humans with the machines, if you like. I think would be interesting.
Lovely. Thank you, Ed.
I'll pick up on one aspect where you were talking about the verticality and can cities, really be true. And I think when you look at all these examples of mixed-use developments, I think the one thing that we have to be very careful of is around public and private. And so we talk about sky gardens in the air, but actually who are they really accessible by and for? And I think that Hong Kong was referenced, and I think what you might see in Hong Kong is examples of these true vertical communities where your hairdressers are up in the sky and all your food courts are up in the sky, and you have a proper community rather than just the walkie-talkie. I've got a big accessible space I have to queue for and pay for. This idea of a proper vertical community.
Thank you. And thank you for a fabulous last question. I can't think of a better point at which to end. So we do have to wrap up now. Just a quick shout out. If you haven't gone to see the amazing art installation, please do. The artist is here. It's fantastic. I'm sure everyone's had a look. If not, do. And of course, massive thanks to our amazing panelists. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.